Thank you so much for having me join you this morning. Thank you, Irma and John and Jennifer, for all your technological expertise and all the details that have gone into the planning of this. I really appreciate it, and it's just such a delight to be here and to see all of you. And as I speak to each of you, some of you before we started, and looking at the list of people I'm having lunch with afterwards, I know that this is an extremely esteemed crowd of people. And so I take my hat off to you, and I tell you that I am absolutely honoured and privileged to be able to spend this time with you. Oh, I have to be careful what I say. It's all being written on the screen behind me. Okay. As you probably know, it was about 31 years ago that women were finally allowed to be ordained as priests in the Church of England. In America, it happened much earlier, in the 70s, and I just watched that wonderful documentary, The Philadelphia 11. I was one of the first in 1994. I was in that first class, and I went back to England last year to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ordination of women in St. Paul's Cathedral. And it was a real celebration. At that time, I had been ordained deacon for 6 years, was ordained in 1988, and I was a part of the campaign for the ordination of women and was elected to the General Synod at 29 years old. I was the youngest member of the clergy on the General Synod, and I was able to cast my vote on that historic day in 1992. I wrote a book about the journey and my connection that came soon after with the Vicar of Dibley. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and share some of that story with you. But this is the book, and there are a few copies on the back table if you'd like to buy one. I'm going to take you back to that day in 1992 when we were in the General Synod after a long debate on the motion to ordain women to the priesthood. So if you could just take yourself back into that historic chamber with all those clergy, bishops, priests, and laity. And I'm going to read to you from my prologue of the book. I ask that you greet the results, whatever they might be, with a dignified silence. Tension filled the debating chamber of Church House in Westminster. George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was about to put an end to the agonizing wait. I had not moved all day from my seat. My body cried out for food, coffee, and painkillers for my pounding headache. But I wanted to hear every word spoken for and against the motion to ordain women to the priesthood of the Church of England. At the end of the debate, we voted. I rose to my feet and moved toward a large oak door engraved with the words "Clergy Eyes." On either side of the door stood tellers, carefully counting each body that passed through. My hands were sweating and my heart was beating wildly. This was the precious vote that I had been elected to cast. Just as I reached the door, I had a fleeting moment of panic and checked that I was going through the right door. This was not the time to make that kind of mistake. The three houses, bishops, clergy, and laity, each had to secure a 2/3 majority for the motion to pass. And we knew it would be close. On the other side of the doors, in the circular corridor surrounding the chamber, those who had voted spoke in hushed tones to one another, and I stood beside one of my colleagues, a good friend from the Manchester diocese. She whispered to me with a look of agony on her face, It feels like we've been pregnant all this time, preparing for new birth, and now at the last minute, we're not sure if the baby will be born alive or dead. As I moved around the corridor, I passed those who had come through the clergy nose door. It was then that I saw my friend, Father Andrew Burnham, who was against the ordination of women. We had vowed to respect each other's positions and to remain friends throughout. We looked at each other in this clear moment of difference, having come through different doors, and we hugged. Though we didn't yet know the outcome of our votes, we were both aware of the pain that one of us would soon feel. After what felt like hours, we were all summoned back into the chamber, and into the silence, the Archbishop read the numbers. I won't read the numbers. We madly tried to do the math. It was so close. Had it passed or not? We weren't sure. The numbers were really close in the House of Laity. My stomach clutched as the Archbishop spoke the words, "The motion is passed." We had, in fact, just achieved that 2/3 majority in the House of Laity by one vote. If one layperson had voted the other way, the whole process would have been set aside until a new synod was elected, and women wouldn't have been ordained to the priesthood for another 10 years. We just felt we weren't allowed to cheer, or we'd been told to be dignified and silent. But we threw our hands in the air and we had a huge sigh of relief. Now we could get back to the work of ministry without being sidetracked. As one of my colleagues said to me, we have been common law priests, and now on November 11th, 1992, the church had decided to make honest women of us. So, as the Church of England dealt with the fallout of that decision, as we approached 1994, when women would actually be ordained in the Church of England, there were so many folk who were opposed, men mainly, who were opposed to the ordination of women, that the synod drew up an act of synod, a motion that would allow those clergy opposed to the ordination of women to leave the church with a financial package to start a new career, or parishes could sign a statement saying they didn't want a woman in their church. And then the big thing was that they allowed the establishment of 2 bishops who would not have their own diocese, but they would be available in the north and the south of England to those who were opposed to the ordination of women. We called them the flying bishops, because they would zoom around wherever there were parishes and clergy who did not want a bishop who had ordained a woman to do their confirmations and ordinations, because their belief was that that by ordaining a woman, a bishop had somehow broken the apostolic line of succession from the early church ordinations, which was male laying hands upon male throughout history, and that somehow now those bishops were tainted, and they had broken that apostolic line of succession. And so, for the sake of the unity of the Church of England, this motion was on the table to keep those folks in the church. A lot of people were supportive of that motion to maintain unity, and in discussions with my fellow women on General Synod, who were all older and wiser than me, they said, there were about 25 of us, they said, "Joy, we've got what we wanted. Let's be gracious and let them have their bishops. And I struggled with that for a long time, and I came to the conclusion that I could not, with integrity, support the act of synod, and that I had to indeed speak against it. And so in the General Synod, my maiden speech was a speech that said, this motion has no theological integrity. This is a justice issue, and if this was about providing special provisions and bishops for people opposed to the ordination of black people, I'm sure that the church would not be as gracious about it. And so, despite my efforts and some of our efforts, the motion passed. And so ever since, the Church of England has had this situation of duality, where we made this decision as a church that was the mind of the church, 2/3 majority everywhere, to ordain women, and yet there are still flying bishops, there are still these provisions for people who are opposed. And what annoys me most of all, and I'll stop after this, is that I believed that that would be, that all those folks would eventually die off, and that we would eventually be good, and that we were just sort of grandfathering in those who were opposed to be kind to them. But no, they are still accepting ordinands for training in the Church of England who are opposed to the ordination of women. And so it's being perpetuated. And I do feel very strongly that that is a mistake, and that we should say, this is the mind of the church, this is what the church voted on, and going forward, there is no place for people to be ordained who are opposed to the ordination of women. So that's my view. Anyway. While I was in the gallery, while I was making that speech, and this is where the intersection with the Vicar of Dibley shows up, I was making that speech. Richard Curtis, who wrote 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Love Actually, Notting Hill, Mr. Bean, Blackadder, all those things, he was sitting in the public gallery. So Richard Curtis is a comedy writer who ended up writing The Vicar of Dibley. And he had written one episode. He felt very compelled to write this comedy series, that would hopefully help the reception of women into the church in more secular, in the secular world. And so he wrote one episode, and then he realized that he didn't know anything about women priests, and he couldn't write any more. So he came to the gallery to look for somebody who would be a consultant, or somebody who would help him develop some ideas for the next episodes. And he heard me making this speech, and he decided that he would co-opt me to help him. And he called me, and I ignored his messages for a long time. I was home. It was in an era where we were as women were being bombarded by the tabloid press and journalists who wanted stories with the headlines, "Vicars in knickers." And we had all been burned a little bit by these journalists. And so I was ignoring anything that sounded like a journalist. And Richard Curtis said, "I'm a writer. I'd really like to talk to you about a project that I'm..." And I just ignored it. I had no idea who Richard Curtis was. And one of my friends who listened to my voice messages said, you really need to call Richard Curtis back. He's the big deal. So I did, and he convinced me that he was not going to create a character that we all laughed at, but that he was going to create a character who was the long-suffering, sort of saintly, central character who was putting up with a village full of crazy people. So anyway, long story short, Dawn and French and Richard Curtis came round to my house, and we met, and Dawn walked into the house with a box of chocolate eclairs and said, "We can't work without chocolate." And she came in, and we had lots of discussions together and lots of meetings, and she asked me things like, what kind of clothes do you wear? But she asked about the details. She came and shadowed me on funerals and came to hear me preach. But more than that, she asked me, what is a young woman like you doing being a Christian in the first place, let alone a priest? Shouldn't you be out clubbing and having fun? And it was a really interesting conversation, because that was a conversation I'd had with myself about how I combined who I was as a young woman with this calling to priesthood, and the whole idea of the importance of being yourself and being available to God. So this was a long time ago, and my life has taken lots of twists and turns. I know that a lot of you have seen some of the episodes of The Vicar of Dibley, and a lot of you have seen the documentary that was made about me when I was young. They just made that available on the BBC archives, and I showed that to my grown-up sons, and they were blown away. They were like, "Oh, I'm so glad we've got this." My dad was in the video, in the documentary, and my mum and dad passed last year at the age of 92, within 6 months of each other. And it's just been an incredible journey. Now, before I move on to the next part of the journey, let me tell you my favourite part. People often ask me, what's your favourite part of the Vicar of Dibley? And my favourite is the animal service, the blessing of the animals, because I was there. I was in the background, I was watching, and I was standing right behind Dawn French, the actress, while she was greeting the animals and the guests. And one guy comes in, and he's a punk rocker, and he has a dog with a big studded collar, and she says, "Hello, what's your name?" And the owner says, "Satan." And Dawn and Geraldine says, "Oh, very good of him to come at all, really." And then there are clips like when she's dealing with David Horton, the Conservative councillor, and he says, he marches into her house and says, "What was that claptrap that you were preaching from the pulpit last Sunday?" And she says, "I think you'll find it was the Sermon on the Mount." Socialist claptrap, yes. Jesus never told everybody to give their money away to the poor. And she said, "I think you'll find he did, actually." But there are some sweet moments that I identify with, because what happened in those meetings with Richard Curtis and Dawn French was that they asked me Richard in particular asked me what my passions were. He said, "What's the sermon you preach over and over again?" And I talked to him about how Christian faith didn't make any sense to me unless it made a difference to the way we lived our lives, and the differences and the choices that we may make in the communities that we live in, and who we vote for. And so hence came, the first 6 episodes had my stamp on them, really. And then I moved to the States. So he was off and away doing his own thing after that. But the first 6 episodes where, she collects, they're raising money for a new stained glass window. And then she sees the famine in Ethiopia, and she's so moved that she actually gives all the money they've collected for the stained glass window away to the fund, the famine. And when it comes to the unveiling of the stained glass window, she unveils it, and it's just clear glass looking over the fields with the sheep in the fields. and everybody kind of understands. And there are a bunch of those episodes that I really enjoyed being a part of. So after that period of time, I was basically a priest and deacon and priest in England for 10 years. And then I met my husband, Jim Wallace, who founded Sojourners magazine and has written a number of books. His latest book is called The False White Gospel. And he doesn't give up trying to fight racism and poverty in this country. And so I recommend that book to you if you're looking for something stimulating to read, The False White Gospel. And we met at a festival in England called Greenbelt, which is a music, arts and justice festival. And he was a speaker. He was one of our speakers, and I was on the board of Greenbelt. And after a 2-year transatlantic courtship, we got married, and I moved to the United States. And at first, I moved to, I worked for a year at Grace Church in Georgetown. And I know there's somebody here who, yes. Is it khaki? Yes. And so that was a wonderful place to be. I covered the rector's sabbatical there. And over the years, my life has taken lots of different twists and turns. And I'm sure if you look back on your life, there's this idea of how our vocations change. And each chapter in our life can look very different. And for many years, I was not employed by the church. I had 2 sons, and I threw myself in, and I had a husband who was traveling and speaking and a public figure. And so I decided I was going to be community-based and focused on raising my kids, because I had them when I was 37 and 43. And so I was an older mother and really thrilled to be a mum. And so I became that mum who raised money at the school auctions, and, you know, I became a baseball mum. It turned out that my boys were really good at baseball. And I became the commissioner of the Northwest DC Little League. And I just threw myself completely into it. And I got to know so many people in the community outside of the church that kind of became my model for ministry. The kind of village priest, my husband used to call me. And I became a substitute teacher in the local school. And they used to call me the chaplain, but I wasn't. I was just the substitute teacher. But I really, if ever I write another book, I always said the title of my next book will be My Altar is the Baseball Diamond. My boys went on to play high school baseball, college baseball, and then to top it all off, this is my boasting mum moment, my youngest, who graduated this year, because he's a dual citizen and has a British passport, he was recruited by the Great Britain baseball team to play in Europe for Great Britain. Who knew that Britain plays baseball? Well, they do, because they recruit the American Brits. And so that was really fun to watch him play in the Czech Republic this summer, and watch Great Britain win the gold. And so I really have become a baseball mum. And then, and for many years, I would do speaking events. I would travel with Jim, and we would do things together, but not in the church. And I felt really happy about that, and very satisfied. But just recently, in the last 2 years, I have reconnected to my tradition. After COVID, I reconnected with St. Columba's Church, the Episcopal Church in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and have, for the last year, have been on the staff. And we now have a new rector, a wonderful woman, young woman, Hilary Raining, and she is fabulous. And we are kindred spirits and are dreaming together about what the future might look like. So in a very part-time, retired role, I'm back in the church at St. Columba's Episcopal Church. So it's one of those sort of full circle journeys, you know, that where I've moved around, done different things, and now find myself back in the folds of the Episcopal Church. And I am so thrilled to be here with you, and I don't want to keep talking for too long. I think I've been talking for a long time. I've got lots of funny stories and other things to tell you, but I'm going to let you ask me some questions. Before I do that, I want to tell you about one of the I've talked about all the different things I've been doing while I was outside the church. Well, two are very special to me. One is a thing called the Wild Goose Festival. I am a co-founder and now the chair of the board of the Wild Goose Festival. And it's a music, arts and justice festival that's based on the Greenbelt Festival, which is where Jim and I met in England. And it's a gathering of 2,000 folks every year in North Carolina at a campground where we celebrate justice and creativity. And the wild goose is the Celtic symbol for the Holy Spirit. And so we dance and we listen to inspirational speakers and we listen to good music and we nurture one another for the journeys that we're on going forward. So that's the Wild Goose Festival, and we've been going for about 13 years now. And the other thing that I have got involved with is when my boys were in high school playing baseball, we took the high school baseball team to the Dominican Republic to do a service trip. And we've been doing that for 10 years now. And we just last year created a non-profit 501c3 organization to establish it as an organization in its own right. Because now we don't just take the Jackson Reed High School team to the Dominican Republic. We take players from DC public schools across the city. And this year in February, we'll be taking 40 players to the Dominican Republic to do service projects, build houses, and play baseball. They love it. The communities love it that we work with and partner with in the DR. And so it's called Building with Baseball. So that takes a lot of my time, and we're just preparing for our next trip in February. So fingers in lots of pies, but very much rooted in the faith and justice community. And one of the things I love about telling my story is that it always helps people to tell their stories. And I'm sure that all of you are thinking, oh yes, that reminds me of what I did and what all the things that I've done and the things that I'm involved in. And we're a movement of people who, by every drop of every little bit of involvement that we have been part of and continue to be part of, we can make a difference in this world. And sometimes it doesn't feel like that, and we lose hope, and it just gets too much, and we get cynical, and we disengage and say, there's nothing I can do. But there's always something, and it's always surprising what difference those small things that we're involved in can make. So, let me see. I have been talking for a long time, and I would like to, I've got other things I can talk about, but I want to focus on the things you want to hear and the questions that you'd like to have answers to. So let's have some questions. There's over here on the right.
Since I have a mic, I'll use it first. 2 short questions. The monarchy, as head of the Church of England, did the Queen ever say anything about women in or out of the priesthood? And what's the current view of the Church of England on the LGBTQ members of the community in the priesthood?
Yeah, the Queen was when I was on the General Synod, we went to the Westminster Abbey to be opened. Each 5-year session would be opened by the Queen in Westminster Abbey. She's a figurehead, really. She would not have any particular say in any of the debates. I feel fairly certain that she would be completely in favour, and that she happily, rubber stamped. They rubber stamp anything that the General Synod decides. When they appoint bishops, it goes to the Prime Minister and the Queen or the King, but they never question the decisions of the Church. So it's a kind of symbolic role in some ways, even though we do have the Church and state very closely connected. The LGBTQ question is more disappointing. The Church of England, the bishops have just recently passed, and I'm not completely familiar with it, but what I understand is that they're still stalling on full approval of the marriage in church of gay and lesbian couples. They totally approve civil blessings, and they'll bless civil marriages in church, but won't actually do the weddings in church, which just seems like, well, hypocritical to me. And and it's also not allowed technically for bishops for the church to ordain a gay bishop. But there are bishops who are gay, and there are clergy who are gay. So it's very much continues to be a don't ask, don't tell situation. So not very bold, in my opinion.
We have a question.
No, I don't.
Oh. I saw the hand.
Any other questions?
Yes, the character of Alice in The Vicar of Dibley, was that a real character, or who was the genius that came up with the character of Alice?
Yeah. You know, the genius of Richard Curtis and the other writers of The Vicar of Dibley is that all of their characters were people that you recognize, right? You go, oh, and there's an Alice in every church. And she might not be the verger, she might be the church warden, or she might be, the choir mistress or whatever, but there's an Alice in every congregation. And the beautiful thing about it is that all those characters, you recognize them, and that's what makes good comedy. There are a couple of people in my congregation who like to think it was them.
I'd be interested in knowing what you can tell us about the set and about the filming locations, and that room, the room
Yes.
where it all happened.
Yes. So the set was in a studio in Shepherd's Bush in England, and they had the rooms all set up. And it was fascinating to me because after they visited with me before the filming of the show, the set was painted in the same colours as the walls in my house. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And yeah, so the village in which it was filmed was an Oxfordshire village called Turville. So if ever you want to go, if you ever go to England and you want to go and find the village, it's Turville in Oxfordshire. And interestingly, one of my friends became the vicar of that church afterwards. And there a constant flow of tourists would come through to look at the church and see the village where it was filmed. And so when they had outside in the village filming, like the animal service or when she's outside, they would film in that village. But whenever there was inside scenes to be shot, they were filmed in a studio in Shepherd's Bush in London. And then they had a wrap party at the end of the final series when it was all finished. And they flew me back from America to be in the audience. And I took my family and my nephews, and we were in the audience of that final episode. And after that, there was a wrap party in the studios at the BBC, and that was a lot of fun. And they did a documentary called The Story of Dibley. So that's somewhere around where they interviewed the cast members and the writers and me. And I'm not sure where you find that, but I bet these days if you went on YouTube and looked for The Story of Dibley, I think it would come up.
There are so many great ball players from the Dominican Republic, and I wonder if your journeys there have led to any stories, interactions with those great players.
Yes, some of the old, retired players, Manny Acta, Pape Frias. There's a number of people that we have run into and connected with while we've been in the DR. But our trips, we always go to a little village called Consuelo, which is really interesting. That the partners there are the Grey Sisters of the Immaculate Conception from Canada. And they've been there since the 1950s. And they worked, as young women who are now retired, they worked to build the community by building schools, by building clinics, a retirement home, and their philosophy was to work with the baseball community for kids, and the Manny Acta who built a centre, the Manny Acta Centre. And through baseball, music and education, they transformed this community and brought together warring tribes and communities of folks. There was the Haitians and the Dominicans and different folks who were always fighting, and she would bring them all together in this school community and really created a unified community through baseball. So that's who we work with, and another organisation called the Foundation for Peace, who have work going on in other parts of the DR with an orphanage for disabled children, and work that goes on in the country bâtés, where the boys go and help build houses and repair things.
2 weeks ago, my son and I were in England. We were in Devonshire looking for a man who left in 1632. We didn't find him, but long story there. But what I did notice in a number of the not very large churches that we visited around the margins of the Dartmoor, one comes to mind because unlike Dibley, it is Gidley. And it's a wonderful, I think, built in the 13th century or something like that. And not much, looking at the neighborhood around it, it's not a large parish. And looking at the space inside it, it couldn't be a large, very large parish. But what struck me was that in a number of those churches like that, there were signs that indicated that they were led by a vicar who also served a number of other little parishes just like that. And in most of those cases, those vicars were women. And I'm wondering if we've not gotten to the point yet in the Anglican Church where women priests are interchangeable with male priests. Is that still a problem? I don't mean, you know what I mean, in terms of their their careers and things. Is that a factor of Devon not being quite as densely populated as perhaps some other?
Well, you've touched on a number of different things there, because I know Devon very well. Actually, Dawn French lives there now, and I go and visit her when I go home. And I have another friend who lives in Sheepstore. And you're right, there are the way England is, because it's the state church, every patch of England belongs to a parish. So there are churches all over the place, and they're all Church of England parishes. That's the parish system. And so in the countryside, you find that there are churches almost in every few villages. There's many, many, many churches. And in years gone by, each of those churches would have had their own vicar or rector. Or there would have been a rector who oversaw all the churches, and they each had their own vicar. And as church attendance has declined over the years, and the folks going forward for ordination has declined, they found a situation where one priest has to cover a multitude of churches. So you might be appointed as the rector of a church, but you'll have 3 other churches that you have to run around and take care of as well. And what has happened since the ordination of women is that women have typically taken those positions that men don't want. And that's why you find some of these really tough assignments, whether they're looking after a number of parishes in the countryside, or whether it's like I did, go to a housing project in the inner city of South London where it's really tough. You find that there are more women in those places because men have more opportunity to choose the nicer jobs. And similarly, we found that women, it's harder for them to rise to positions of influence. So you'll have a lot of women at first, after women were ordained, there were lots of women assistant vicars and associates. And then gradually they would be given the responsibility of their own church. But you didn't often find a woman archdeacon, for example, or women. So when women bishops, see, this is the interesting thing, bishops, women weren't allowed to be bishops until 10 years later. So that was even more recent. But when that happened, because we don't elect our bishops in England like you do here, the bishops just appointed women bishops. Boom, 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 boom. So we suddenly had loads and loads of assistant bishops because it didn't depend on them running for election and being the token woman that didn't get the job. They were just appointed. So we were good on that. And then, as you know, we've just recently had the first woman appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is very exciting. And she will face a lot of kickback from the more conservative dioceses and provinces around the globe.
Thank you so much, Joy. Could you talk a little bit more about the Archbishop, the new Archbishop, and how that's going to play out?
She is, she's a really good egg, and she was the Bishop of London for many years and did a really good job in a fairly diverse diocese, theologically. And she's a peacemaker and a reconciler, and she won't trouble the waters too much, I don't think. She had another career before she was ordained, and she was a high-level executive in the nursing field, in the healthcare system in England. And I have one of my best friends, I'm the godmother to her daughter, went to youth club with her and said, and told me a little bit about her. They were in youth club together. And so she's sort of like been in the church and been a Christian since she was a teenager and grew up through the Church of England and is now the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think it will be interesting to see. I think she will stand firm. I think she's got a thick skin. I don't think she's going to be easily rattled. And I think, as in everything that we do as women, minds will be changed through their experience of her ministry. And I think that will play out over time.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit more about Dawn French and her life now? How old is she?
Yeah, she's it's lovely actually. She's like a couple of years older than me, so she's 67 now.
She's young.
Yes. And we're kind of going grey together, and so we've been friends since we first met, and she's been through some tough times. She was married to another actor comedian called Lenny Henry, who was in a British comedy show called The Chef, but he's very well known and loved if you Google him. But they got divorced, and that was a painful divorce. And she has an adopted daughter called Billy, who's grown up now, and she's had it's not been an easy journey with Billy, and now Billy has a daughter, and so Dawn is a grandmother, and I'm a grandmother too. My oldest son I have a 6-month-old grandson called James, and so we're kind of experiencing the same things in real life. She lives in Devon. She used to live in Cornwall, and she's remarried. And she and her husband, Mark, it was interesting because she met him when she was writing a book, because Dawn is a writer as well. If you look up on Amazon, Dawn French books, she's written some fabulous books and a novel or two as well. And she was researching a character for one of her novels who was an addict and homeless, and her mother, Dawn French's mother in Cornwall, used to work in a homeless shelter. She used to manage a homeless shelter, and she knew that there was a guy there who worked with her mother who she needed to talk to because she didn't want to create a character that wasn't authentic in her book. So she went to talk to Mark, who was a colleague of her mother's at this shelter, and they got into conversation together about the book and the character, and they fell in love with each other. And he didn't follow her work as an actress. He just knew her as his colleague's daughter that he'd known over the years, and so it's a very lovely relationship they have. And they've just moved to Plymouth to be closer to, or just outside Plymouth, to be closer to her daughter, Billy, and the granddaughter. So, yeah, she's doing great. And she comes to London to do pantomimes, and, you know, she'll be the wicked witch in, you know, a pantomime, and she does her own monologue show that she travels and does that in places like Australia. And so she's busy, and when she's not performing and doing comedy, she's writing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, with microphone, sorry.
Has she been in any other series besides Vicar of Dibley?
Yes, she has. And I think you would have more success than my memory if you Googled it. There's a lovely one I just watched. The trouble with Maggie. Is it? The Trouble with Maggie something, and it's hilarious, about a woman in a village who, yeah, she's a bit of a gossip, and yeah. But anyway, have you seen it? Yeah, I can't remember, Maggie Coleman or something, or Cole, yeah. But she's been in a number of different series as well, so I'm sure you'll be able to find them. I didn't talk much about my work in my first job when I was ordained as a deacon. Before I was ordained as a priest, I was on a housing project estate, and it was a really run-down place, and as I said, there weren't any men who wanted to go there, and it had been vacant for 2 years. And it was the daughter church of a bigger parish church on this housing project with tower blocks. And, you know, it was really high crime, drug-related crime, and tough place to be. And but I really wanted to be there. And I had to get the priest on Sundays, when we had Holy Communion, I had to invite a priest to come and do the magic bits, because I wasn't allowed to do it as a deacon. And so that was an interesting period of time. But I wore my collar, and I would go, and I did baptisms and weddings and funerals. And as a deacon, you can do all those things. And people saw me as the local clergy person. And so the injustice of not being allowed to be priest became even more obvious at that point. And that was when it became a tipping point. It was once women were allowed to be deacons, nobody really knew the difference. And the only 3 things that are different is that a priest can do the prayer of thanksgiving over the bread and wine at the Eucharist, the blessing of the congregation, and the absolution of sins after the confession is said. Those are the only 3 things that distinguishes a priest from a deacon. And so, you know, it became an obvious problem when I, who was looking after this church during the week and doing all the community baptisms and pastoral care and preaching, and had to get a man to come in and do these, as I say, the magic bits in the liturgy on a Sunday morning. So it kind of highlighted the thing. But I would go up and down the elevator on the housing project, and, you know, I'd get into the elevator that was stinky and, you know, needles all over the place, and people would come into the elevator with me, a group of, you know, a gang of young guys, and they'd say, "Are you in fancy dress or what?" And but I slowly got to know the community and built my friendships and trust. But one day there was a newspaper article. The local newspaper did a piece welcoming me to the community. And then the tabloids picked it up. and the tabloids came to interview me, and I told them about the great things that were going on the estate, and they took pictures. And then the next day in the Daily Express, they had a headlines, Crusader of Crack City. And this article made me look like I was, you know, at the forefront with all the police behind me trying to solve all the drug problems on the estate. And it just was not a good look. And I was mortified. And I was afraid I was going to get a brick through the window saying, it's time for you to go. And so I talked to one of my colleagues who'd been working on the estate for a long time. And he took me to the local pub on the housing project called the Spanish Steps. Now, you might picture a nice English pub called the Spanish Steps, but this is not. You're right. It had no windows. It was like this building on the estate, and nobody went in there for a casual drink. You know, the only people who went in there was to do a drug deal. And so I went in there with my colleague, and he's introduced me to these guys, and, you know, they're sitting there with a medallion around their neck and gold glinting in the corner, and I'm like, hi, I'm Joy, I'm the minister. I'd been there about a year by then. And I sat down, he said, she wants to talk to you about something. So I told them what had happened and about the article in the newspaper. And he said, this is the guy you need to talk to. And he was like the lead gang member of like the Yardies or something. And his name was Headley. And I said, I'm just here to serve and to be alongside you and experience life with you. And he goes, yeah, I know, you baptized my nephew last week. And I was like, oh, great. And then anyway, we kept talking, and I had a drink with them. And at the end, he put his arm around my shoulders and he goes, don't you worry, darling. He said, don't you worry. If you get into any trouble, you just tell him you know Headley. And so from then on, I felt really good because I had my collar. So I had Jesus and I had Headley. So I felt well covered. Yeah. So I feel like I hope I've covered enough for it to be a satisfying session. Yeah. Yes, good. We've got a couple more minutes, I think.
So you grew up as the child of a priest.
I did.
And was that, and that church must have been in that same neighborhood?
It was not the same neighborhood. It was the same diocese.
Okay.
And my dad's parish was St. Stephen's, South Lambeth. And it was a real challenge also.
Yes.
I grew up in the inner city. I've always been really comfortable in the inner city. All of my parishes were what they called urban priority areas. Mm-hmm. And then when I moved here, I married Jim and moved to Columbia Heights.
Where are you? Yeah, same thing.
And that was also a tough neighborhood to be in.
Yes.
And but then once my kids were a bit older, we moved to AU Park because we wanted to be next to the baseball fields.
Right.
So, and I was schlepping across town anyway to the schools because my kids went to Wilson High School and Alasdair.
And then what about the church? The church in the documentary, was that the church you left from to come to the United States?
Yes.
And how is that church doing?
Doing great.
With all those ministries that you were involved with.
Yes.
We loved the pictures of you at the tea dance.
Tea dance, yeah.
Yes. And, eye to eye and up close and personal with the residents who look a lot like us.
Yeah. Well, I go back to visit that parish, and they have a new young woman priest. They had a couple of different priests after me there, and with varying degrees of success. But they've got a wonderful young woman there now, and the last time I was there, she said to me, I just try to emanate the spirit of joy. and all my old friends who are still alive there say that they absolutely adore her. And now, with everything since COVID, people have been live streaming their services. So every now and then I go in and watch a service at Emmanuel because I love that community so much. And I love to go back and visit. But they're doing great.
Thank you. Good.
Yes. There's a question over here. We have the microphone. Thank you, John and Pat, for all your running around with the microphone.
How did you experience your call then to the priesthood?
Good question. I was a very rebellious teenager. And I remember as a 15-year-old, after a big argument with my parents, standing at the bottom of the stairs, yelling at my dad and mum, saying, I am never going to marry a priest. And then, of course, I became one. But in the meantime, I went off to college. I think it's really important sometimes for the young people of clergy in particular, or anybody really. You have to rebel, and you have to go and find your own identity before you can come back. And I did some of that. And in fact, I went to teacher training college. I did a year in Haiti, which really changed my life. Working on a team, a relief and rehabilitation team in Haiti. Came back, and I taught for about 5 years in an elementary schools in England before I experienced a call to ministry. And in that period of time, I was involved in my local church. And my parents had moved on to another church, and I was in my own church in my own right. And so I was leading camps for kids. Youth. I was in the youth leading group, and I would do visiting. I was part of the visiting team and services at retirement community and so on. And people began to say to me, and I was teaching, and people began to say to me, Joy, you have this way of communicating complicated theological issues in a way that people can understand. What they meant was I dumbed it down because that's the only way I understand it. So they said, why don't you go into the ministry? And there was no opportunity then for women to go into the ministry, really. I thought about going to Bible college, but I wanted to stay in my own church, in the Church of England. And what was the only thing that women for a long time were deaconesses, which was part of the laity, and before that they were called lady workers. My dad, who was a clergyman, had a lady worker when I was a kid, and we called her Auntie Margaret. And Auntie Margaret was a lady worker. And, fabulous. All these women over the years have been doing the work without the recognition. And then they were allowed to be, then there were deaconesses. So in the Church of England, your hierarchy is bishops, priests, clergy. The holy orders is the bishops, clergy, and laity. And laity are not in the holy orders. So women were deaconesses and they were in the laity. And so in 1987, when women were allowed to be ordained as deacons, they became clergy and moved from being laity to clergy, but still did the same training. So when I responded to a call basically, to go and train to be a deaconess. And at that time, women weren't allowed to be priests, and they weren't even deacons. And I went to Cranmer Hall in Durham, in England, for my training, and trained alongside the men. We all did the same classes, the same practical experience. And when we came out of seminary, the men were ordained as deacons, and the women were licensed as deaconesses. And it was while I was at seminary in 1987 that the synod voted that women could be deacons. And so I was the second group that came out of seminary and was ordained as a deacon. And so that's how it happened. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been so good to be with you.